Before the first name was spoken in accusation, before rope or flame or iron entered the story, there was fear, not the sudden terror of invasion or disaster, but a quieter presence, patient, domestic, and familiar. It sat beside the hearth at night and lingered in the pauses between conversations. It lived in the space where neighbors watched one another a little too closely, where survival depended not on strength alone, but on belonging. The villages of early modern Europe were small worlds, bound tightly by necessity. Life unfolded within narrow borders. A handful of homes, a shared well, common fields, a single church whose bells measured both time and obedience. Harmony was not an ideal, it was a requirement. To fall out of step with the community was to risk more than loneliness. It meant exposure, hunger, suspicion, the slow turning away of faces that once knew your name. In such places, fear did not announce itself loudly. It accumulated, like soot on timber beams. It gathered through long winters and failed harvests, through the steady toll of illness and infant graves. The earth could betray without warning. Crops withered, livestock sickened. A cough became a death sentence. And when misfortune arrived, as it always did, the question followed close behind: why here? Why now? And why us? Faith offered answers, but not always comfort. The world was understood as fragile, suspended between divine mercy and unseen corruption. Every blessing had a cause. So did every calamity. When prayers went unanswered, when order fractured despite devotion, something else had to explain the rupture. Fear demanded a shape. It found one in difference. A woman who lived alone at the edge of the village. A healer whose remedies worked too often or not enough. A neighbor who spoke sharply, who did not bow easily, who seemed untouched by the rhythms of grief and gratitude that governed communal life. None of these traits were crimes, but they were irregularities. And in a world where survival depended on predictability, irregularity felt dangerous. Fear thrives where uncertainty is constant. The villagers did not need monsters in the forest. They already lived with death in their homes. What they needed was coherence. A sense that the world, however cruel, still obeyed rules. When those rules appeared to break, fear whispered that someone must be responsible, that the disaster had a human cause. The hearth was the center of village life. It was where stories were told, where bread rose and children slept, where warmth fought back the cold. Fire was protection, but it was also a reminder of how quickly things could be lost. One spark, one careless moment, and an entire life could be reduced to ash. Fire, like fear, was both a comfort and a threat, depending on who controlled it. At night, when the work was done and the fields lay silent, imagination filled the dark. Shadows lengthened. Sounds carried farther than they should. An owl's cry became an omen. A flicker in the distance suggested movement where none could be seen. In these moments, fear did not feel irrational. It felt observant, attentive, almost wise. Children learned early which paths not to take, which homes to pass without lingering. Adults learned the value of restraint, of not standing out too brightly, of not inviting attention. Reputation mattered more than truth, memory more than evidence. What people believed about you could determine whether you were protected or exposed, and belief, once settled, was difficult to dislodge. The fear beneath the fire was not hatred. It was anxiety about scarcity, about change, about the slow erosion of certainty. It was the fear of losing control in a world that offered very little of it to begin with. Most villagers would never leave the land they were born on. Their lives were mapped in advance by weather, by lordship, by the church calendar. Agency was rare. When it appeared in others, it was unsettling. This fear did not yet speak of witches. It did not require spells or demons. It only needed a sense that something or someone was misaligned with the delicate balance of the world, that someone had stepped outside the invisible lines that kept chaos at bay. Over time, this unease learned a language. Sermons gave it words, stories gave it memory, authority gave it permission. But at the beginning, it was only a feeling, a tightening in the chest when misfortune struck twice in the same season. A glance exchanged across the square. A name left unspoken, but not forgotten. Anthropologists would later describe this as scapegoating. Psychologists might call it projection. But for those who lived it, it felt like survival instinct, a way of restoring order by isolating threat. The community was a body, and anything that caused pain had to be identified, contained, or removed. Fear, after all, rarely sees itself as cruel. It sees itself as necessary. The earliest accusations were not shouted. They were murmured, shared cautiously as if testing the ground beneath them. Have you noticed? Do you remember when? Ever since These were not statements of certainty, but of pattern seeking. The human mind reaching for meaning where randomness was unbearable. And once fear found a listener, it multiplied. The fire at the center of the village continued to burn. Meals were cooked, children laughed. Life outwardly went on. But beneath that fire, something smoldered. A readiness. A quiet agreement that if things grew worse, and they always did, someone would have to answer for it. This was the soil in which the witch trials would one day grow, not in madness but in familiarity, not in sudden hysteria, but in years of accumulated dread. The gallows and pyres were still far off, unseen beyond the horizon of this first chapter. But the fear that would feed them was already present, warming itself by the fire, waiting for a name. And when that name was finally spoken, it would feel less like invention and more like recognition. Chapter 2, when belief became a weapon. Faith was not born as a threat. It entered the world as shelter, in centuries defined by uncertainty. Belief offered something rare and precious: coherence. It told people that suffering had meaning, that chaos followed a pattern, that life, however brief or brutal, was not unfolding at random. Faith explained the seasons, sanctified labor, and placed every soul within a vast, ordered design. It softened the terror of death and gave grief a vocabulary. In the villages of Europe, the church was more than stone and timber. It was the axis around which time itself revolved. Bells marked the hours. Saints' days measured the year. Scripture framed birth, marriage, illness, and burial. To believe was not merely to accept doctrine. It was to participate in the shared rhythm of existence. But belief, once entrusted with order, can grow intolerant of disorder. As centuries passed, faith did not remain static. It was shaped by institutions, refined by councils, and guarded by men who feared fracture more than doubt. Theology hardened into doctrine. Doctrine hardened into law. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, belief began to change its posture. It stopped listening. It began to command. The late medieval world was not spiritually calm. It was anxious. The Black Death had torn through Europe like a divine scream, killing without discrimination. mocking prayer and piety alike. Wars dragged on for generations. The climate cooled. Harvests failed. Every catastrophe raised the same unspoken question. Had God turned away? Or had his people strayed? When suffering persists, belief often looks inward for betrayal. Church authorities increasingly framed the world as a battleground between sacred order and hidden corruption. Evil was no longer distant or abstract. It was intimate, personal, lurking within communities that claimed righteousness but harbored sin. The idea took hold that faith alone was not enough. Faith had to be defended. Heresy became the great fear. Not because it was common, but because it was contagious. A single unorthodox idea could fracture unity. A single dissenting voice could spread doubt like rot through timber. To question doctrine was no longer curiosity, it was danger. And so belief armed itself. Sermons shifted in tone. Where once they had offered comfort, they now warned of vigilance. Hell grew vivid. The devil grew clever. The faithful were told that evil did not always roar. It whispered. It disguised itself as wisdom, independence, or healing outside approved channels. The world they were taught was filled with snares designed to test obedience. Obedience became proof of faith. This shift was subtle but profound. To believe was no longer simply to trust in God. It was to submit, to align one's thoughts, behaviors, and suspicions with an authorized vision of reality. Doubt was not a private struggle, it was a social risk. Questioning the system meant threatening the fragile wall holding chaos at bay. Fear gave belief its edge. The church did not invent this fear. It inherited it, but it refined it, gave it language, and eventually, purpose. Evil was no longer an accident of the world. It was an active force, working through human agents. And if evil had agents, they could be identified. Faith had once explained misfortune. Now it began to assign blame. Those who operated outside sanctioned belief systems, folk healers, mystics, midwives, were increasingly framed as rivals to divine authority. Their knowledge was not dismissed as ignorance but reinterpreted as corruption. If their remedies worked, they must have learned from dark sources. If they failed, they must have intended harm. There was no neutral ground. Doctrine simplified complexity. It reduced the chaos of lived experience into moral binaries, pure and impure, obedient and deviant, sacred and profane. Such clarity was comforting. It relieved believers of ambiguity, but it also erased nuance, and with it mercy. Belief, sharpened into certainty, became a tool. Not all who wielded it did so with cruelty. Many truly believed they were defending the world from collapse. They saw themselves as guardians of order, standing between civilization and spiritual decay. To tolerate deviation felt like inviting catastrophe, and so enforcement followed conviction. Confession became ritualized. Surveillance became communal duty. The faithful were encouraged not only to examine their own souls, but to watch others. Silence could be read as complicity, tolerance as weakness, mercy as negligence. In this climate, accusation did not feel like betrayal. It felt like responsibility. The blade of belief cut cleanly because it was sanctified. When punishment came wrapped in prayer, it did not appear violent, it appeared necessary. To destroy a body was tragic, but to save a soul or protect the community was framed as an act of love. This is how faith, once a refuge, learned to wound without hesitation. The transformation was not sudden. It unfolded across generations, reinforced by repetition, ritual, and authority. Children grew up absorbing a worldview where obedience was safety and difference was threat. They learned which questions were allowed and which led to darkness. By the time witchcraft entered the formal vocabulary of the church, the weapon was already forged. The fear was already disciplined. Belief no longer needed proof, it only needed alignment. And once belief demands obedience, it no longer needs truth. The blade had been sharpened quietly, patiently, in candlelit halls and echoing naves. When it was finally raised, it did not feel like violence to those who held it. It felt like faith fulfilling its duty. But every weapon, no matter how sacred its name, leaves wounds. And the blood it spills always tells a story. One belief alone can never fully silence. Chapter 3. Women who would not bend. In every society there are figures who live just beyond the edges of expectation. They are not rebels in the loud sense. They do not always seek defiance. Yet by the simple fact of how they exist, they unsettle the world around them. In early modern Europe, many of these figures were women. And history would remember them not for who they were, but for what others feared they represented. The villages that fed the witch trials were rigid ecosystems. Survival depended on roles clearly defined and faithfully performed. Men labored in fields or workshops. Women managed households, bore children, tended the sick, and obeyed the quiet grammar of submission that shaped daily life. Stability relied on repetition. To live otherwise was to interrupt the rhythm that kept fear at bay. Most women bent because bending was survival. But some did not. Widows were among the most visible. Without husbands, they occupied an uncertain space, no longer governed by a man, yet still present within the community. They owned property, made decisions, and spoke for themselves. Their independence was not chosen so much as inherited through loss, but it was independence nonetheless. In a world that equated female autonomy with disorder, this alone was enough to provoke suspicion. Healers, too, stood apart. Their knowledge passed through hands rather than books, through observation rather than doctrine. They understood plants, pain, childbirth, and death in ways that did not always align with sanctioned belief. When their remedy succeeded, they were quietly sought after. When they failed, they became dangerously visible. The same hands that delivered infants were blamed when mothers died. The same knowledge that soothed fevers was reinterpreted as manipulation. Familiarity with the body, especially the female body, was framed as transgression. What could not be explained within approved structures was recast as unnatural. Outspoken women carried their own risk. Speech was power, and power unsettled hierarchies built on silence. A woman who argued, questioned, or refused deference disrupted more than conversation. She challenged the invisible architecture of obedience. Her words lingered. They spread. They made others uncomfortable, not because they were false, but because they were heard. And then there were the women who were simply alone, those who lived at the village's edge, geographically or socially, those without children, without kin, without the protective web of reputation. Loneliness invited projection. It allowed others to fill the silence with story. The absence of witnesses made accusation easier. The absence of advocates made defense unlikely. Isolation became evidence. These women were not accused because they practiced magic. They were accused because they did not conform, because their lives could not be easily categorized, because they embodied the possibility that a woman could exist outside prescribed boundaries and survive. That possibility was terrifying. Autonomy, especially female autonomy, threatened the moral logic of the time. The world was imagined as a hierarchy ordained by God. Every deviation suggested fragility in that order. If a woman could live without male authority, what else might unravel? If she could heal without clerical oversight, what else might be questioned? Fear does not require proof. It requires resonance. Communities under strain by famine, disease, or loss looked for reasons. Women who would not bend became mirrors for collective anxiety. They reflected back everything the village feared but could not name: vulnerability, change, the erosion of certainty. By condemning them, the community reassured itself that order could still be enforced. The irony is that many of these women were deeply embedded in communal life. They were caregivers, counselors, and witnesses to suffering. They knew the secrets of households, the weaknesses of bodies, the rhythms of grief. Their proximity to life's most fragile moments made them both essential and dangerous. Knowledge is unsettling when it cannot be controlled. The witch trials did not target women because they were powerful in the conventional sense. They targeted them because they were ambiguously powerful, because their influence existed outside formal authority. It was informal, relational, difficult to measure, and therefore difficult to contain. Gendered fear shaped every accusation. Male nonconformity could be punished, but female nonconformity was pathologized. It was framed as corruption rather than dissent. A man who challenged order was dangerous. A woman who did so was unnatural. Language mattered. Accused women were described not just as criminals but as distortions of womanhood: unmotherly, unchaste, unsubmissive. Their alleged crimes were symbolic as much as literal, violations of social expectation masquerading as spiritual threat. Confessions, when they came, often echoed these themes. Women admitted not only to imagined crimes but to moral failings, envy, anger, resentment. Emotions that had long been denied them were recast as evidence of evil. Their interior lives were put on trial, and yet beneath the layers of accusation, a quieter truth remains. These women were human. They mourned. They endured. They adapted. In a world that demanded submission, some simply lived as themselves. That alone was enough to mark them. The witch trials would later dress these fears in theology and law. But at their core, they were acts of social discipline. Warnings written in flesh. They taught women what happened when one stepped too far from expectation, when one refused to bend. The fires that followed did not just consume bodies, they consumed possibilities. Lives that hinted at other ways of being were erased, leaving behind a narrower vision of womanhood, safer, quieter, and easier to control. Yet history remembers them still, not as monsters, but as figures standing at the fault line between fear and freedom. Women who did not bend, and in doing so, revealed the cost of autonomy in a world terrified of its own instability. Their stories linger like embers, dim, persistent, and unwilling to be extinguished. Chapter 4. The Invention of the Enemy. Enemies are rarely found fully formed. They are imagined first. Before the witch had a face, she had a function. She existed as an answer waiting to be shaped, a solution to fear that had grown too large, too abstract, too unsettling to endure without direction. Chaos demands a culprit. Anxiety seeks a target. And belief, when pressed by uncertainty, begins to draw outlines around the invisible. Witches were not discovered in the margins of society. They were assembled, piece by piece, through language, The early modern world was flooded with words. Sermons echoed weekly from pulpits carved high above the faithful. Pamphlets spread through towns and markets, cheap enough to reach hands that had never held a book. Woodcuts stamped images into memory. Twisted figures, midnight gatherings, bodies bent in devotion to darkness. These were not records of events. They were instructions for perception. Before long, people did not simply fear evil, they recognized it. The witch became a composite figure, stitched together from theology, folklore, and rumor. She borrowed traits from ancient pagan spirits, from heretical caricatures, from the anxieties of clerics and magistrates alike. Each retelling sharpened her silhouette. Each repetition made her feel more real. Importantly, this enemy was invisible until named. Misfortune had always existed. Crops failed long before witch trials. Children died. Illness struck without reason. What changed was interpretation. Sermons reframed these events not as tragedy, but as evidence. Pamphlets taught readers how to connect suffering to intention. If disaster struck, it was not random. Someone had willed it. The witch was that will made flesh. What defined her was not magic, at least not primarily. Magic was merely the language used to describe her supposed influence. Her true crime was disobedience, spiritual, social, and moral. She stood accused of refusing the boundaries that belief demanded, of acting without permission, of existing without sanction. This was a powerful accusation in a world obsessed with order. The church warned that the devil was not a distant tyrant, but an organizer. He recruited, he corrupted, he built networks. Evil, the faithful were told, worked communally, mimicking the structure of the church itself. Witches gathered, they conspired, they inverted sacred rituals, they mocked obedience by parodying it. Such claims did more than terrify. They rationalized surveillance. If evil could hide in plain sight, then vigilance was a moral duty. If witches looked like neighbors, then neighbors had to be watched. The line between protection and paranoia blurred until they became indistinguishable. Printed texts accelerated this transformation. Pamphlets did not ask readers to imagine the witch. They showed her. She was drawn hunched and leering, her body marked by excess or decay. These images traveled farther than any sermon. They standardized fear. They taught communities what to look for. And once people knew what to look for, they began to find it everywhere. The enemy's traits were deliberately flexible. She could be old or young, poor or prosperous. She could harm through touch, through words, through silence. Any deviation could be folded into the narrative. Any resistance reinterpreted as proof. This was not an accident. A vague enemy is a useful one. By keeping the definition fluid, authority ensured that no one could fully escape suspicion. Innocence became difficult to prove when the crime itself was invisible. The absence of evidence was no longer reassurance. It was concealment. Fear thrived in this ambiguity. What mattered was not what witches did, but what they represented. They were symbols of everything belief sought to control. Sexuality outside marriage, knowledge outside institutions, loyalty outside hierarchy. They embodied the terror that society might fracture from within. The invention of the enemy served a deeper purpose. It externalized doubt. When belief falters, it rarely admits weakness. Instead, it projects uncertainty outward. The witch absorbed that projection. She became the repository for contradictions that could not be reconciled. Why does God allow suffering? Why does prayer fail? Why does obedience not guarantee safety? Rather than confront these questions, belief displaced them. The problem was no longer divine mystery, it was human betrayal. This shift was devastatingly effective. Once the witch existed as a concept, accusation required no imagination, it required alignment. To accuse was to participate in a shared worldview, to affirm communal values. Doubt became dangerous not because it was false, but because it threatened cohesion. And so communities learned the language of enemy making. Sermons instructed faithful on how witches behaved. Pamphlets cataloged their crimes. Courts formalized their confessions. Each institution reinforced the others, creating a closed system where belief fed evidence and evidence fed belief. Within this system, the witch was always already guilty. The invention was complete when the enemy felt inevitable. When people began to say, not if witches existed, but how many? When absence was read as oversight rather than relief. When fear became expectation. This is how societies create enemies without ever meeting them. The witch trials would later be remembered as outbreaks of hysteria. But hysteria suggests chaos, loss of control, irrational frenzy. The truth is quieter and more unsettling. The enemy was not born from madness. She was engineered through reason distorted by fear. She was a solution to uncertainty, a narrative that restored order by naming disorder, a story that made suffering intelligible even if it made justice impossible. Once invented, the enemy could not easily be undone. She justified punishment. She validated authority. She offered a sense of clarity in a world that felt dangerously unstable. And clarity, when purchased at the cost of humanity, becomes its own kind of violence. The witch did not emerge from the shadows on her own. She was summoned, carefully, deliberately, by words spoken in sacred spaces, by images pressed into paper, by stories repeated until they felt like memory. By the time the fires were lit, the enemy had already been fully imagined. All that remained was to make her real. Chapter 5. Law in the shape of God. Justice once lived in the realm of custom. It was negotiated in fields, settled by elders, softened by familiarity. But as fear grew heavier, justice demanded firmer hands. It sought permanence, authority, a voice that could not be questioned. And so law learned to speak like God. The courts that presided over the witch trials did not see themselves as instruments of cruelty. They saw themselves as guardians standing between a fragile world and the collapse that threatened it. To them, law was not merely civic order. It was sacred duty. Every judgment echoed with divine intent. Every sentence carried the weight of salvation or damnation. When fear entered the legal record, it did not appear as panic. It arrived as procedure. Trials were carefully staged. Accusations were recorded. Witnesses summoned. Oaths sworn. The language of righteousness wrapped each act in solemnity. This was not chaos. It was order performing itself. And that performance mattered more than truth. The accused did not face neighbors alone. They faced an institution that claimed heaven as its witness. In early modern Europe, secular and religious authority were deeply entwined. Judges often believed that their role extended beyond maintaining peace. They were correcting spiritual imbalance. Witchcraft was framed not as mere crime, but as treason against God. To tolerate it was to invite divine punishment upon the entire community. This belief transformed violence into obligation. The courtroom became a ritual space. Its architecture reinforced hierarchy. The accused stood below, the judge elevated, the law positioned as intermediary between earth and heaven. Questions were asked not to discover uncertainty, but to confirm doctrine. The answers mattered less than their alignment with expectation. Guilt was presumed because the crime itself was metaphysical. Evidence followed belief, not the other way around. Illness, misfortune, unusual behavior, these were treated as signs rather than circumstances. The law did not ask whether a witch caused harm. It asked how deeply she was entangled with evil. Once accused, innocence became almost impossible to demonstrate. The legal system absorbed theology and returned it as verdict. Torture, when used, was framed as revelation. Pain was believed to strip away deception, forcing truth to surface. Confession obtained under agony was not seen as corruption of justice, but its fulfillment. The body was treated as an obstacle to truth, something that needed to be broken so the soul could speak. This logic was chillingly consistent. If the devil granted witches unnatural endurance, then failure to confess proved guilt. If confession came too quickly, it confirmed alliance with darkness. Resistance and compliance alike were interpreted as evidence. The system was sealed against doubt. Law did not merely permit cruelty, it ritualized it. Every step followed precedent. Manuals instructed judges on how to identify witches, how to question them, how to interpret silence. These texts lent authority to instinct, fear, and prejudice. They standardized suspicion. What had once been rumor became admissible fact. Fear was no longer a feeling, it was documentation. Public executions reinforced this transformation. They were legal conclusions made visible, staged as moral theater. The community gathered not to question the sentence, but to witness its legitimacy. Prayer accompanied punishment. Clergy stood beside executioners. The message was unmistakable. This violence was not vengeance, it was justice. And justice, when sanctified, does not apologize. The law's greatest power lay in its impersonality. Responsibility dissolved into process. Judges followed procedure. Clerks recorded statements. Executioners carried out orders. Each participant could claim distance from the outcome. No single hand held the blade. The system itself delivered the blow. This diffusion of guilt made cruelty sustainable. Those who presided over these trials often believed sincerely in their righteousness. They were not sadists. They were functionaries of belief. The horror was not fueled by hatred alone, but by conviction. The certainty that failing to act would be worse than acting brutally. Such certainty is dangerous. When law mirrors divine authority, it inherits divine infallibility. To challenge it becomes heresy. Appeals to mercy sound like rebellion. Doubt itself is suspect. In this environment, the legal system no longer protects the vulnerable. It polices deviation. The accused were caught in a paradox. To trust the court was to submit to its narrative. To resist was to confirm it. The law had no room for ambiguity, because ambiguity threatened its claim to sacred order. And so complexity was erased. Lives were reduced to charges, relationships to testimonies, memories to confessions. The human texture of existence, the grief, fear, and confusion that shaped behavior, was flattened into legal categories, which or not. Guilty or condemned, law thrives on clarity. Fear provides it. The witch trials reveal something enduring about institutions under strain. When systems feel threatened, they often seek moral absolutes. They turn to law not as a tool of balance, but as a weapon of purification. Violence becomes acceptable when framed as necessity. Suffering becomes collateral in the defense of order. The law, once shaped by God, no longer needed compassion. It had procedure. Long after the flames died out, records remained, inked pages cataloging names, accusations, sentences. To later generations, these documents appear cold, almost bureaucratic. But within them is a quiet testament to how fear, once formalized, can move through institutions with devastating efficiency. No screams are recorded, no hesitation, only conclusions. This is the legacy of law when it confuses authority with righteousness, when it mistakes certainty for justice, when it forgets that its power was meant to restrain fear, not enshrine it. The courts believed they were saving the world. In doing so, they condemned it to remember, because when law wears the shape of God, it forgets that even faith was meant to bend toward mercy. Chapter 6. Confession under the rope. Truth was once imagined as something revealed, a thing uncovered slowly through patience, testimony, and reflection. But in the age of the witch trials, truth changed its nature. It became something buried, resistant, evasive, and dangerous. And like all things believed to be hidden by evil, it was thought to require force. The rope entered the story quietly, not as brutality, but as method, as necessity, as a last, regrettable step taken in service of clarity. Pain was not introduced as cruelty. It was introduced as purification, a means of stripping away lies, of peeling back the flesh until only honesty remained. In the logic of the trials, the body was suspect. It was believed to be the devil's favored disguise, capable of deception, endurance, and silence. The soul, by contrast, was thought fragile, unable to withstand suffering without revealing itself. Torture was framed as a dialogue between pain and truth, with suffering acting as interpreter. This belief did not arise from madness. It emerged from a worldview that distrusted ambiguity. Judges were trained to see denial not as innocence but as resistance. Silence was read as concealment. Consistency was evidence of rehearsal. The accused existed within a framework where every response confirmed guilt. Confession was not the discovery of truth. It was the conclusion already assumed. And so truth had to be extracted. The chambers where this extraction took place were rarely theatrical. They were enclosed, dim, methodical. The instruments were simple: rope, rack, iron. Their power lay not in spectacle, but in repetition. Pain administered slowly, incrementally, under watchful eyes that recorded every word. Each scream was interpreted not as protest, but as progress. The accused were told that confession was mercy, that admitting guilt could save their soul even if their body could not be spared. This inversion was devastating. It turned survival against itself. To endure pain without confessing was framed as allegiance to evil. To break was framed as spiritual awakening. There was no path that led out unscathed. Confessions followed patterns. Under agony, the mind seeks relief, not accuracy. Memories blur. Imagination fills gaps. Suggestions offered by interrogators became scaffolding for a narrative. The accused learned what kind of truth was required and shaped their words accordingly. Witches confessed to meetings they never attended, to pacts they did not understand, to crimes that mirrored pamphlets more than lived experience. Their testimonies were not personal histories. They were rehearsals of doctrine spoken through broken bodies. Pain standardized truth. Once recorded, these confessions became evidence, not only against the speaker, but against others. Names were demanded, networks imagined. The suffering of one fed the suspicion of many. Torture multiplied itself, spreading outward through accusation like a contagion. The rope did not only extract confessions, it created them. What is most unsettling is how calmly this process was justified. Manuals instructed judges on how much pain was permissible. Limits were set, observed, then quietly exceeded. The language remained clinical, controlled, moral. Suffering was never described as suffering. It was described as illumination. In this system, pain became proof. A body that broke confirmed the presence of guilt. A body that endured confirmed unnatural assistance. Either outcome validated the premise. The logic was closed, airtight, and merciless. The accused were caught in a paradox that consumed identity itself. Their own words, spoken under torture, were used to erase them. Confession stripped away not just innocence but authorship. Their story no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the court. Even repentance was choreographed. Those who confessed were sometimes encouraged to display remorse publicly, to weep, to beg forgiveness. These performances were held up as moral clarity, evidence that justice had worked. The community was invited to witness not the destruction of a human being, but the restoration of order. The spectacle hid the cost. Psychologically, torture fractures time. Pain collapses past and future into an unbearable present. Under such conditions, truth loses meaning. The mind seeks only escape. That escape in the trials was confession. What was confessed mattered less than the act itself. The system did not seek accuracy. It sought confirmation. Confession under the rope was not about uncovering reality. It was about aligning narrative with belief. Once aligned, doubt could be silenced, and doubt was the real enemy. Those who administered torture often believed they were reluctant participants, that the rope was regrettable but necessary, that the ends justified the means. This belief allowed cruelty to coexist with conscience. It insulated perpetrators from the weight of their actions. The horror of the witch trials lies not only in the pain inflicted, but in how thoroughly it was normalized. Suffering was reframed as service. Victims were transformed into collaborators in their own condemnation. The language of salvation masked the mechanics of control. Long after the confession was recorded, its echo remained. In transcripts, in sermons, in the collective memory of the community, and the words spoken under agony became fixed truths, immune to reconsideration. No record notes the moment when pain overtook meaning, when words ceased to refer to reality and began referring only to survival. History bound to documents inherited these distortions as fact. This is the quiet tragedy of confession under the rope. Truth did not disappear. It was drowned in ritualized suffering, in procedures that confused endurance with guilt, in a moral framework that mistook brokenness for clarity. The rope was never just a tool, it was a philosophy, a declaration that truth could be forced, that the human spirit could be bent into coherence through pain. But pain does not reveal truth, it replaces it. And what emerged from the chambers of confession was not understanding, but obedience, etched into flesh, recorded in ink, and carried forward as justification. The witch trials would leave behind many lessons. Among the darkest is this: when suffering becomes evidence, humanity becomes expendable, and once truth learns to scream, it is no longer truth at all. Chapter 7, Property, Power, and the Pyre. Violence is rarely motivated by belief alone. Beneath theology, beneath fear, There are quieter forces at work, measurable, tangible, and deeply human. Land, money, status, the things that survive when faith falters and motivate action when morality hesitates. Behind many accusations lay a ledger. Early modern Europe was a world where land meant survival. Fields determined food, homes determined belonging. Property was not merely wealth. It was identity, inheritance, and security bound together. To own land was to exist with legitimacy. To lose it was to drift toward invisibility. Disputes over property were common and rarely resolved cleanly. Boundaries shifted. Documents were vague. Memory served as evidence. In such an environment, resentment accumulated easily. Grievances lingered for generations, passed down like heirlooms. And when formal avenues failed, accusation offered another path. The witch trials created opportunity. An accusation did more than condemn a soul, it unsettled ownership. Once accused, a person's property could be seized, frozen, or redistributed. In some regions, the costs of imprisonment and execution were extracted from the accused's estate itself. Justice funded itself through dispossession. The fire consumed more than flesh. It cleared the ground. Widows were especially vulnerable. Without male guardians, their claims were precarious. Inheritance laws varied, but suspicion was consistent. A woman who owned land disrupted expectations. A woman who refused to relinquish it invited scrutiny. If she were removed, the problem resolved itself. Neighbors knew this. Accusations often emerged from within communities, not imposed from above. They arose from proximity, shared fences, shared wells, shared histories of quiet conflict. A boundary dispute became a moral failing. A contested inheritance became evidence of corruption. Personal grievance learned the language of righteousness. Resentment found permission. The trials offered a sanctioned method for settling accounts without appearing vengeful. Accusation could be framed as duty, as protection of the community. The accuser did not need to acknowledge motive. The system absorbed it, laundered it through procedure, and returned it as justice. Power learned to hide behind belief. Local elites benefited disproportionately. Those with influence could steer suspicion away from themselves and toward the vulnerable. Testimony carried weight unevenly. Reputation mattered. A respected landholder's word could outweigh a lifetime of quiet labor. The accused rarely had advocates. Once property entered the equation, outcomes hardened. Confiscated land was rarely returned, even if charges faltered. Estates were divided, reassigned, absorbed into existing hierarchies. The material gains outlived the moral reckoning. This was not coincidence. It was incentive. The pyre functioned as a reset, a brutal but effective means of reordering social space. It removed those who complicated the map. It simplified ownership. It stabilized power under the guise of purification, and it did so publicly. Executions were not hidden acts. They were communal events. The community gathered to witness not only punishment but redistribution. Everyone understood what was at stake, even if it was never spoken aloud. Fear enforced silence. Benefit ensured complicity. The flames instructed as much as they destroyed. This economic dimension does not negate belief. It explains its persistence. Ideology thrives when it aligns with interest. When moral narratives justify material gain, they become difficult to dismantle. The witch trials endured because they served multiple purposes at once: spiritual reassurance, social control, and economic consolidation. Those who benefited rarely questioned the process. Even resentment itself became evidence. Long-standing feuds were reinterpreted as premonitions. If two neighbors had quarreled for years and one was accused, the conflict was retroactively framed as foreknowledge. Memory was rewritten to support outcome. History followed the winner. The accused were often those who lacked protection, those without powerful kin, without allies, without resources to navigate the legal maze. Poverty increased suspicion. Dependence bred contempt. Asking for help could be reimagined as manipulation. Refusing help could be read as arrogance. There was no safe position. The pyre resolved complexity by annihilating it. Once burned, disputes vanished. Claims dissolved. Silence followed. The community could move forward, lighter in conscience and richer in land. But something was lost in that clearing. Contested voices, the ones that questioned, resisted, or complicated authority, were erased along with the accused. Knowledge disappeared. Alternative ways of living vanished. What remained was a narrower world, more orderly, but also more fragile. Power consolidated itself by pretending to defend belief. Over time, the economic motives behind accusations were obscured by narrative. History remembered witches and judges, but not boundary lines or inheritance contracts. The material benefits were absorbed into normalcy, their origins forgotten. This forgetting was convenient. It allowed later generations to view the trials as irrational excesses rather than calculated systems, as superstition rather than strategy. But the records tell a different story, one where land transfers coincide with executions, where debts vanish alongside bodies, where authority expands in the aftermath of fire. The pyre was not only an end, it was a beginning. In its wake, the social landscape shifted. Those who survived learned where power lay. They learned what kinds of claims were dangerous, what kinds of lives were tolerated. The message was clear. Security flowed upward, obedience downward, and fear filled the gaps. Property, power, and punishment became entwined so tightly that disentangling them became impossible. Belief provided the language. Law provided the mechanism. The pyre provided finality. What burned was not just a person, but a challenge. The witch trials remind us that violence often wears many masks, that beneath the rhetoric of morality, there are transactions being completed, accounts being settled, futures being quietly rearranged. The flames erased the inconvenient, but they also illuminated something enduring. When justice serves power, it leaves ash where truth once stood. And long after the fire died down, the land remained, tilled by new hands, claimed by new names, bearing silent witness to what it had cost to make it so. Chapter 8. A crisis without language. Disaster does not arrive with explanation. It arrives as absence. Empty fields where grain once stood, streets too quiet for the season, bodies thinned by hunger, breath shortened by sickness, winters that refused to end. In early modern Europe, catastrophe unfolded not as a single event, but as a slow unraveling. Each year a little colder, a little crueler than the last. The land itself seemed to turn away. Harvests failed with alarming regularity. Rains came late or not at all. Frost lingered into spring. The climate shifted subtly, relentlessly, ushering in what later generations would call the Little Ice Age. But those who lived through it had no such language. They only knew that the old rhythms no longer held. Hunger hollowed communities from the inside. Then came disease. Plague did not explain itself. It moved without logic, striking the devout and the indifferent alike. Prayer failed. Medicine faltered. Entire households vanished in days. The dead outpaced the living, and burial became a task without ceremony. In the face of such devastation, meaning became urgent. Human beings do not endure chaos easily. We seek patterns, causes, narratives, anything that transforms randomness into intention. When systems collapse and expertise proves powerless, explanation migrates elsewhere. It does not disappear, it adapts. Superstition is not ignorance. It is desperation, searching for structure. When famine and plague stripped the world of predictability, people reached for what remained familiar: belief. But belief under strain changes shape, it narrows, it sharpens, it looks for agency where none is visible. If crops failed, someone must have cursed the soil. If children sickened, someone must have poisoned the air. If winter lingered, someone must have angered God. Catastrophe without cause is unbearable. Catastrophe with a culprit is survivable. The witch emerged here, not as fantasy, but as explanation. A human face placed upon inhuman forces. She gave shape to suffering that otherwise felt cosmic and cruel. Through her, famine and disease became intentional acts rather than indifferent processes. This transformation mattered deeply. If disaster had intention, then it could be confronted. If it had an author, then that author could be punished. The randomness of nature was too vast, too impersonal to fight. But a neighbor, a body, a name could be accused, tried, destroyed. Control returned briefly. The timing of the witch trials aligns closely with periods of extreme stress. Peaks in accusation often followed years of failed harvests or outbreaks of disease. This was not coincidence. Fear seeks resolution when pressure mounts. Communities under threat look inward, searching for weakness, and weakness was redefined as deviance. Those already marginal, widows, the poor, the strange, absorbed suspicion easily. Their lives stood apart from the norm, making them ideal vessels for blame. When everything failed at once, they became symbols of that failure. The trials offered a sense of action in a world that felt increasingly ungovernable. Killing a witch did not restore crops or halt plague, but it offered psychological relief. It suggested that suffering was not meaningless, that it could be answered with ritual, judgment, and fire. The execution became a gesture against despair, a performance of agency. This is the tragedy at the heart of crisis without language. When science cannot yet explain, when systems collapse faster than understanding, belief fills the void, not gently but forcefully. It demands clarity. It simplifies complexity into moral cause and effect. In doing so, it sacrifices nuance for certainty. Climate collapse was not recognized as environmental shift. It was read as moral imbalance. Plague was not understood as contagion, but as punishment. Hunger was not economic or climatic. It was spiritual failure. These interpretations were not foolish. They were human. People used the tools available to them: scripture, folklore, memory, story. They drew on inherited frameworks to survive unprecedented strain. But those frameworks carried consequences, especially when paired with fear and authority. Superstition did not merely explain disaster, it personalized it. And once catastrophe had a human face, that face could be erased. The witch trials can be read in part as rituals of explanation, attempts to speak the unspeakable, to narrate loss in a way that preserved meaning. They were born not from excess belief, but from belief stretched beyond its limits. A crisis without language forces violence into speech. The fires that followed did not warm the land. They did not cure the sick, but they created the illusion that suffering had been addressed, that something had been done. In a world unraveling, that illusion was powerful. It is easy, from a distance, to judge this impulse, to see superstition as failure, but doing so misses the deeper truth. When understanding lags behind experience, fear becomes the interpreter, and fear does not speak gently. The witch stood at the intersection of climate, disease, and despair. She was not the cause of catastrophe, but the answer to it. A story told loudly enough to drown out uncertainty. In that sense, the trials were not merely acts of cruelty, they were symptoms, expressions of a world struggling to explain itself as it changed too quickly to comprehend. The real horror lies not only in what was done, but in why it made sense at the time. When language fails, belief steps forward. When belief falters, superstition sharpens. And when superstition is given power, catastrophe finds a victim. The crisis demanded meaning. The trials supplied it, at the cost of everything else. Chapter 9. The crowd learns to watch. Violence becomes most powerful when it is shared, not hidden in shadows, but displayed, measured, deliberate, and witnessed. The executions of the witch trials were never private acts of justice. They were public ceremonies staged carefully in town squares and open fields where as many eyes as possible could gather. These deaths were meant to be seen, to be remembered, to instruct. The crowd was not an audience by accident. It was the point. Men, women, and children stood together as sentences were carried out. Vendors sold food. Bells rang. Clergy prayed aloud. The atmosphere hovered uneasily between solemnity and routine, as if terror had been woven into the fabric of everyday life. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Each execution functioned as a lesson. The condemned stood at the center, transformed from neighbor into symbol. Their body carried meaning far beyond the individual life being ended. They represented the boundary between order and transgression, obedience and defiance. By destroying that body in public, authority made its limits visible. The message was unmistakable. This is how far you may go. The crowd learned through repetition. They learned which behaviors invited suspicion, which words carried risk, which lives were considered expendable. They learned that deviation was not merely discouraged, it was fatal. Fear did not need to be explained. It was demonstrated. Public punishment creates memory. Long after the flames died down, the image remained. Children who watched executions grew into adults who no longer needed to be warned. The lesson had already been written into their understanding of the world. Control persisted not through constant violence, but through the memory of it. This is how obedience outlives terror. Executions also redistributed responsibility. When everyone watched, no one felt solely accountable. Guilt dissolved into the collective. The crowd became part of the process, even if silently. Witnessing transformed violence into communal knowledge. To look away was to risk suspicion. To watch was to belong. The spectacle normalized brutality by framing it as moral necessity. The presence of clergy sanctified the act. The presence of officials legitimized it. The presence of neighbors confirmed its acceptance. Together they formed a ritual that replaced empathy with order. The victim's humanity faded beneath the symbolism. Cries were drowned out by prayer. Smoke blurred the face until it became unrecognizable. The individual disappeared, replaced by the lesson. What remained was not grief, but clarity. The crowd learned to read fear as safety, Public executions did not merely punish crime, they produced conformity. They taught restraint without needing to articulate rules. Boundaries became intuitive, enforced not by law alone, but by memory and imagination. People adjusted their behavior accordingly. They spoke less, questioned less, lived smaller lives. The crowd absorbed the warning and carried it home, into kitchens and fields and beds. The execution did not end at the pyre, it echoed through daily life. This is the quiet efficiency of spectacle. Authority did not need to monitor every action. The crowd did it for them. Self-censorship became instinct. Fear internalized itself. The most effective control is the kind that no longer requires enforcement. Public death trained the eye. The condemned were stripped of complexity. Their pasts were erased. Their relationships severed. In the moment of execution, they were no longer mothers, healers, or neighbors. They were cautionary figures, living examples of consequence. This simplification made the violence bearable. If the victim could be seen as wholly other, corrupt, dangerous, deserving, then their destruction felt justified. The crowd learned to see selectively, to focus on symbols rather than suffering. Over time, this way of seeing became habit. Executions also served as moments of unity. In a world fractured by hunger, disease, and fear, the spectacle offered a shared experience, a collective reaffirmation of values. Everyone present understood what was being defended. Belonging was reinforced through exclusion. Those who attended were reminded that they were safe, because they were not the ones being punished. The crowd drew comfort from contrast. As long as someone else stood at the center, they remained on the periphery. This dynamic deepened loyalty to the system, but the cost was profound. Public punishment eroded compassion. Repeated exposure to suffering without space for mourning numbed the senses. Violence became familiar. Disturbance dulled into expectation. The extraordinary became routine, and once cruelty feels ordinary, it becomes difficult to challenge. The witch trials relied on this transformation. Fear alone is unstable. It flares and fades. But fear reinforced by ritual endures. It becomes tradition, memory, culture. The crowd learned not just to watch, but to accept. Acceptance is not always agreement. Often it is exhaustion. In a world where survival required conformity, resistance felt too costly. Watching became a way to endure, to remain unnoticed. Yet history remembers the silence as complicity. The crowd did not light the fire, but it fed it. Each execution etched a deeper line between power and vulnerability. Each lesson narrowed the space of acceptable existence. Over time, the boundaries grew so familiar that they no longer needed to be marked with flame. The crowd had learned its role: to watch, to remember, and to stay within the lines drawn in smoke. Long after the trials ended, the structure remained. Public punishment had taught a lasting truth about authority, that visibility can be more powerful than force, and fear more enduring than chains. The lesson was not lost on history. It waits quietly in every place where violence is performed rather than hidden, where the crowd gathers not to question, but to learn what happens when someone steps too far and watches. Chapter 10. Silence as survival. Fear does not always demand screams. Often it prefers quiet. As the witch trials unfolded, something subtle began to change within the communities that watched them. Not laws, not doctrine, but behavior. Words grew fewer, gestures smaller. Curiosity retreated behind caution. People learned, slowly and painfully, that survival did not require innocence. It required restraint. Silence became a skill. Villages that once thrived on shared labor and communal knowledge began to withdraw inward. Conversation shortened. Confidences were withheld. Neighbors spoke carefully, aware that language itself could become evidence. What one said today might be remembered tomorrow, reinterpreted, repeated with sharpened edges. Truth, once shared freely, became dangerous. Fear taught its lessons efficiently. Those who spoke too openly vanished. Those who asked the wrong questions attracted attention. Those who defended the accused found themselves under suspicion. The pattern did not need explanation. It was observed, absorbed, and obeyed. Silence offered protection. This was not cowardice. It was adaptation. In an environment where accusation functioned as contagion, distance felt safer than solidarity. Empathy became a liability. Conformity, a shield. Communities learned to regulate themselves. The most powerful form of control is not enforcement, but anticipation. People began to censor their thoughts before they reached their mouths. They learned which opinions to bury, which memories to forget, which relationships to downplay. Even grief was moderated. To mourn the wrong person too visibly could raise questions. Emotion itself became suspect. Silence reshaped identity. Individuals dissolved into acceptable shapes. Difference was sanded down, not by force, but by fear. Over time, people forgot which parts of themselves had been surrendered and which had never existed. This erosion was quiet, but profound. The trials did not require constant violence to persist. Their aftermath did the work for them. Once fear was internalized, it reproduced itself. People watched one another, not out of malice, but vigilance. Everyone became both observer and observed. Trust frayed. Communal bonds weakened as self-preservation took precedence. Where once help had been offered without hesitation, now it was calculated. Where once stories were shared, now they were withheld. Silence crept into spaces once filled with life. The cost of this restraint was not immediately visible. Outwardly, order returned. Accusations slowed. Fires burned less frequently. But beneath the surface, something essential had been lost. A culture of expression had been replaced by a culture of avoidance. The absence of conflict masked the absence of connection. Fear had succeeded. Silence also distorted memory. Events were not discussed, not processed, not understood. Trauma remained unspoken, passed down indirectly through behavior rather than narrative. Children learned what not to say without ever being told why. This is how fear survives generations. Silence taught people how to live within invisible boundaries. It drew lines more effectively than law ever could because it lived inside the mind. No guard was needed when everyone carried the rules within themselves. Conformity felt like safety. Those who survived did so by becoming less visible, by blending in, by refusing distinction. Over time, this narrowed the range of acceptable life. Innovation slowed. Dissent disappeared. Difference was treated as risk rather than resource. The witch trials did not end with their last execution. They lingered in the habits they produced. Silence, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. Even after belief systems shifted, even after laws changed, the reflex remained. People hesitated before speaking. Communities avoided confronting uncomfortable truths. History itself was softened, simplified, and eventually mythologized. What was not spoken could not be challenged. Silence protected individuals, but it weakened the whole. It prevented accountability. It allowed structures of power to persist without scrutiny. It turned suffering inward, where it could fester without recognition. Yet for those living within it, silence was rational. In a world where truth could kill, survival demanded discretion. Fear redefined virtue. Obedience became wisdom. Conformity became care. For oneself, for one's family, for one's future. The tragedy is not the people were silent. It is that silence worked. It kept people alive. It kept communities intact, at least on the surface, but it also ensured that the lessons of fear went unchallenged, that the system which produced the trials could dissolve without ever being confronted, that the patterns could return, reshaped, whenever crisis demanded them. Silence does not erase violence. It preserves it. The witch trials taught a generation how to disappear inside themselves, how to make peace with injustice by not naming it, how to endure by becoming smaller. Those lessons echo far beyond their time. Even now, silence is often mistaken for stability, conformity for harmony, restraint for wisdom. But history remembers what silence was born from. Fear taught it. Fear sustained it. And long after the fires went out, silence remained, standing guard over a past that still waits, unspoken, beneath the surface of the present. Chapter 11. The myth that outlived the fire. Fire has a way of erasing details. It reduces lives to silhouettes, histories to ash. And when the witch trials finally burned themselves out, when courts grew uneasy, when belief shifted, when the cost became impossible to ignore, it was not truth that remained. It was an image. The witch survived the flames. Long after the executions ended, long after laws quietly changed and accusations lost their authority, the figure of the witch endured. But she endured emptied of her reality, stripped of names, of villages, of context. What remained was a shape, crooked, shadowed, exaggerated, untethered from the women who had once carried it. History retreated. Folklore stepped forward. The transition was subtle. No announcement marked the moment when trauma became story. Over time, memory softened. The pain of the trials proved too heavy to carry forward in full. Communities that had once watched the fires preferred distance to reckoning. It was easier to remember witches as creatures of legend than as neighbors. Myth offered relief. In stories, the witch no longer suffered. She threatened. She cackled forests, poisoned apples, whispered curses. Her body twisted to match the moral distortion assigned to her. She became old when age symbolized decay, ugly when beauty symbolized virtue, alone when isolation symbolized danger. These traits did not emerge randomly. They were revisions. By transforming the witch into caricature, society absolved itself. The myth implied that the accused had always been monstrous, that the violence enacted against them was inevitable, even necessary. Complexity vanished. Responsibility dissolved. Folklore is rarely neutral. Fairy tales carried these images forward, embedding them in childhood imagination. The witch became a warning, not a memory. A symbol of disobedience, hunger, envy, female power misused. Her origins in social fear and institutional violence were buried beneath enchantment and moral simplicity. The story was easier to tell this way. In myth, the witch chooses evil. She is not constrained by circumstance or suspicion. She is free and therefore culpable. This inversion mattered. It reversed the truth of the trials where choice was absent and guilt was imposed. The myth rewrote suffering as intent. What had once been a system of control was transformed into entertainment. Fires became metaphors. Executions became climactic moments in tales of justice restored. The audience no longer needed to confront the reality of courts, torture, or property seizure. The witch absorbed it all, becoming the sole bearer of blame. This is how societies forget without forgetting. The myth preserved fear, but erased accountability. It allowed the emotional residue of the trials to survive without the discomfort of history. The witch could still be hated, feared, destroyed, now safely removed from real people. She became timeless. This timelessness was deceptive. It suggested that the witch had always existed, lurking at the edges of human imagination. But the witch of folklore was not ancient. She was modern, born of specific centuries, specific crises, specific anxieties. By detaching her from those conditions, myth made her seem inevitable. Art reinforced this process. Paintings, illustrations, and later literature fixed her image, hunched, wild-haired, surrounded by symbols of corruption. Each repetition made the caricature more familiar, more authoritative. The original women, healers, widows, outsiders, faded further into obscurity. Their voices were not preserved. The myth spoke for them. Even sympathetic portrayals often failed to restore context. Romanticized witches appeared as tragic figures or misunderstood rebels, but still as abstractions. Rarely were they returned to the material realities that had condemned them. Land disputes, hunger, legal terror, silence. The story remained incomplete. The endurance of the witch myth reveals something uncomfortable. It shows how easily violence can be aestheticized once its victims are no longer present. How suffering becomes symbol. How history, when too painful, is recast as legend, and legends are easier to live with. The witch of folklore functions as a container for unresolved fear. She absorbs anxieties about power, gender, knowledge, and autonomy. Each generation reshapes her to suit its needs. She persists because the questions that created her never fully disappear. But the cost of this persistence is truth. When myth replaces memory, understanding is lost. The witch trials become curiosities rather than warnings. Their victims become fictional rather than human. The systems that enabled the violence remain unnamed, free to reassemble under new guises. The fire ends. The pattern does not. To recover the real story of the witch requires excavation. It means peeling back layers of narrative until the woman beneath becomes visible again, frightened, ordinary, entangled in forces far beyond her control. It means acknowledging that the myth did not emerge from imagination, but from law, fear, and silence. This is difficult work. Myth comforts by simplifying. History unsettles by complicating. It insists that monsters are often constructed, and that societies are capable of extraordinary cruelty when convinced of their righteousness. The witch, as folklore remembers her, is powerful. But the women erased by that image were powerless. They did not ride storms or command demons. They endured suspicion, isolation, and accusation. They suffered not because they were feared, but because fear needed a form. The myth outlived the fire because it was useful. It allowed the past to be remembered without being confronted. It preserved fear while disguising its origin. And so the witch remains, etched into storybooks, costumes, and imagination, while the real history sleeps beneath layers of distortion. To tell the true story is not to banish the myth. It is to understand what gave birth to it. Only then can the fire be extinguished completely. Chapter 12. Control wears many faces. The witch trials have long been remembered as outbreaks of superstition, moments when reason failed and fear took over. But this explanation, comforting in its simplicity, misses something essential. The trials were not merely expressions of panic, they were systems, deliberate, repeatable, and instructive. They were rehearsals. What unfolded across early modern Europe was not chaos, but organization. Fear did not roam freely. It was guided, shaped, and directed. Institutions learned how to gather it, concentrate it, and deploy it with precision. The witch trials were never truly about spells or demons. They were about governance under strain. Control, after all, rarely announces itself honestly. The trials emerged during a period of profound transformation. Old feudal structures were weakening. Central authority sought greater reach. Religious unity fractured. Populations grew restless under famine, war, and disease. In this environment, power needed new tools, methods that could stabilize society without constant force. Fear proved effective. The witch trials demonstrated how fear could be converted into compliance, not through constant violence, but through selective terror. A few spectacular punishments achieved what armies could not. Widespread behavioral change. Communities disciplined themselves. Authority extended its reach into private life. This was governance at its most intimate. By framing witchcraft as an existential threat, institutions justified extraordinary measures. Surveillance became virtue. Accusation became duty. Participation became proof of loyalty. The population was transformed from passive subjects into active enforcers of order. People learned to govern one another. The brilliance and danger of this system lay in its adaptability. Control did not rely on a single authority. Church and state reinforced each other, but the work was distributed. Neighbors watched neighbors. Families regulated themselves. Fear circulated horizontally as much as vertically. No single tyrant was required. The trials also tested the power of narrative. By defining an enemy that was invisible yet omnipresent, authority learned how to sustain vigilance indefinitely. There was no final victory over witchcraft, because its threat could never be fully eliminated. This ensured ongoing relevance and ongoing control. An endless emergency is a powerful tool. Legal procedures refined this experiment. Courts standardized suspicion. Confessions created data. Records preserved precedent. What began as local panic evolved into trans-regional practice. The trials became portable, adaptable to different regions, cultures, and conditions. Fear learned how to travel. Importantly, the system did not require belief in witchcraft to function. Participation mattered more than conviction. One could doubt privately and still comply publicly. Silence, conformity, and ritual obedience were sufficient. The structure rewarded behavior, not belief. This distinction is crucial. Control does not depend on shared faith. It depends on shared fear. The witch trials taught institutions how to bypass persuasion and move directly to compliance. When fear is properly cultivated, questions disappear. Doubt retreats. People act not because they are convinced, but because they are afraid of standing out. Uniformity follows naturally. The accused themselves played a role in reinforcing this structure. Confessions, extracted under pressure, provided narratives that justified the system. Each confession confirmed the worldview that demanded it. Victims were transformed into evidence, their suffering repurposed as proof. The system fed on itself. What appears from a distance as irrational cruelty reveals itself as something colder. a test of how much fear a society can absorb before it breaks, and how effectively that fear can be redirected outward. The trials revealed that fear, when ritualized, does not destabilize order. It can strengthen it, at least temporarily. Control wears many faces. In the trials, it wore the face of faith, of law, of protection. It claimed to defend communities from unseen danger. But its deeper function was to teach obedience under uncertainty, to show that authority could define reality itself. If the court said witches existed, then they existed. If the court said you were one, then you were. Reality bent accordingly. This lesson did not vanish with the end of the trials. It was absorbed into institutional memory. Future systems would not need pyres to apply it. They learned subtler methods: surveillance without spectacle, punishment without ritual, fear without fire. The witch trials were inefficient in their violence, but efficient in their pedagogy. They demonstrated how crises could be leveraged, how enemies could be invented, how moral language could disguise structural power, how populations could be encouraged to surrender autonomy in exchange for perceived safety. These lessons would be reused. What makes this history unsettling is not its distance, but its familiarity. The mechanisms are recognizable, the language changes, the symbols shift, but the structure remains. Control still presents itself as protection. Fear still demands unity. Dissent is still framed as danger. The trials remind us that governance is not only exercised through laws and armies, but through stories. Stories about threat, purity, loyalty, and survival. Whoever controls those stories controls behavior. The witch was one such story. She allowed fear to be externalized, managed, and punished. She gave authority a reason to intervene, to regulate, to discipline. Her destruction reassured the many while sacrificing the few. This is the oldest exchange in politics. To say the trials were not about magic is not to say magic was irrelevant. It was the vocabulary used to describe disobedience. It translated social anxiety into spiritual crime. It made control feel righteous. And righteousness is the most effective mask power can wear. The witch trials ended not because society rejected control, but because the method became unsustainable. Too many died. Too much doubt accumulated. Authority adjusted. The experiment concluded, not in failure, but in revision. Control evolved. The legacy of the trials is not found only in graves or archives. It lives in the enduring question they pose. How much fear will a society accept in the name of order? How willingly will it trade understanding for certainty? Control always claims necessity. It always speaks the language of survival. The witch trials show us what happens when that language goes unchallenged, when fear is organized, ritualized, and sustained long enough to feel natural. They were not an aberration. They were a demonstration. And once learned, such lessons are never truly forgotten. Chapter 13. What still hunts us? The fires have gone cold. The scaffolds have rotted. The names etched into court records now sleep beneath dust and time. And yet, something remains. The witch trials did not end with their final execution. They did not vanish when belief shifted or laws reformed. What ended was the spectacle. What survived was the pattern. History does not repeat itself precisely. It rarely needs to. Instead, it remembers structures, shapes of fear, habits of control, reflexes learned under pressure. The witch, as a figure, no longer walks openly through villages, but her shadow still moves whenever panic is given purpose. The pyres are cold, but the conditions that lit them are not. Whenever a society enters crisis, when systems strain, when explanations fail, when the future feels unstable, fear looks for form. It searches for something close enough to blame, human enough to punish. Authority, sensing opportunity, steps forward with answers that promise clarity over complexity. And once again, an enemy is named. It may not be a woman in the woods. It may not speak the language of spells or demons, but it will be familiar. It will be someone accused of corruption rather than disagreement, someone framed as a threat to order rather than a challenge to it, someone whose removal promises relief, even if only briefly. The witch returns not as folklore, but as function. This is the lesson history keeps offering, and we keep resisting. The witch trials reveal how easily fear can be organized, how suffering can be redirected, how belief, law, and spectacle can merge into a single mechanism that feels protective even as it destroys. These dynamics do not belong to the past. They belong to human systems under stress. What changes are the symbols, not the structure. The witch once absorbed anxieties about hunger, disease, and disobedience. Today, other figures are asked to carry that weight. The language evolves. The accusations modernize. But the emotional logic remains intact. Fear demands simplicity. Power provides it. The danger lies not in belief itself, but in belief unexamined, belief that stops asking questions and starts enforcing answers. The witch trials show what happens when certainty replaces curiosity, when obedience replaces understanding, when silence replaces truth. They show us how quickly protection becomes persecution. What is most haunting is how reasonable it all felt at the time. The people who watched the fires believed they were preserving their world. They believed danger had been identified, action taken, order restored. The pattern persists because it works, temporarily. Fear offers relief before it demands a cost. The witch returns whenever authority convinces us that safety requires sacrifice, that unity requires exclusion, that questioning is a threat. She returns whenever systems reward conformity and punish complexity. She returns when we stop seeing people and start seeing symbols. The final warning of the witch trials is not about superstition. It is about vigilance, not against imagined enemies, but against the mechanisms that create them, against the urge to trade humanity for certainty, against the comfort of blame. History does not hunt us. We hunt ourselves. The past leaves markers, not to trap us, but to guide us. The witch is one such marker. She stands at the edge of memory, pointing not backward, but inward, asking us to recognize the moment when fear begins to feel righteous. That is the moment everything is at risk. The pyres are cold, but their heat lingers in every society that confuses control for care, obedience for peace, silence for safety. The witch remains, not as a monster, but as a warning history keeps trying to teach. Whether we learn from it is the only question that still matters.